Hey, welcome to the show. I'm reporter Tyler Orton, and we are on BIV today. And throughout the week, we are presenting a series of interviews covering women in business in British Columbia. And one issue of utmost importance is the wage gap between men and women. Vancouver-based tech company Unbounce is leading a new initiative. It's called the Pay Up for Progress Pledge, and it aims to close that gap. And it is notable. I've got some numbers maybe I can share a little bit later on. And it already has some notable partners on board since launching on Monday. And with us today, it's Leslie Collin. She is Vice President of People and Culture at Unbounce. And Leslie, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Tyler.
So
I'm
for
really
anybody
happy to
who
be
might
here.
not be familiar, what is kind of the driver behind this? Why are you guys so inspired at Unbounce to get ahead of this problem and address it?
Yeah, so we agree with you that the pay gap is a huge issue and something that needs to be tackled directly and head on. I think for us, what we found is that a few years ago when we are the classic startup story, grew up from, handful of employees over the last 5 years to a very solid, medium-sized, steady business. And when we took the opportunity to analyze our pay for the very first time, it's not something you do when you're a handful of employees. But when we started to actually look into it, we found a gender pay gap. And we were able to close it immediately, which was great. We were in the position to be able to do so. But I don't know that it's it's the focus of a lot of companies on an ongoing basis to actively analyze and do more than assume that we're doing the right thing and that bias isn't creeping into the compensation, whole compensation process. So we really wanted to be at the forefront of this because we found something, we closed it, and we've done a bunch of work over the past few years to create processes and procedures that make sure that that gap stays closed for us. And sometimes working in HR can be an isolating field, and companies may just not know where to start when they're a small and medium size. So we want to help them start.
So what are maybe those processes and procedures like? Because, okay, it's great that you can address this gap. How do you make sure that it does not emerge at another point down the road?
That's a really great question. So sometimes in tech, in business, people are like, "Ew, process. Process is the enemy of done. It slows down decision making and work." When it comes to pay, process and guidelines is the most impactful way forward to ensure equity and fairness. So when I talk about that, that means creating salary bands for all the roles that you have and ensuring that you have a really good understanding throughout all of your managers and all of your people leaders of what those salary bands actually mean. So when you go to consider, if somebody says, "Hey," or is very confident and able to negotiate a really fantastic new salary for themselves, it falls in line with what the philosophy and the compensation guidelines for that specific role are. So we don't have outliers. We don't have somebody being able to negotiate their way into an organization significantly higher than a peer that's maybe been there for a few years. So that's one way. Another way is to ensuring that you really understand how you want to pay. What that means is that everyone pays differently, and knowing where you want to pay, how you want to pay, and what your total compensation package is for an employee and be able to offer that transparently is really, really important. And then being able to check that against what market data is saying. So staying competitive as an organization, it's not just a good thing for pay equity and, ensuring fairness on an ongoing basis, but as a business strategy, being able to confidently say that we are achieving our strategy around meeting the market or leading the market from a pay perspective, and knowing you're staying competitive in an extremely tight talent market space is extremely important for any business.
So when I was researching this issue, I found that there was a study from earlier this year from ADP Canada. They found that there was about a 24% gap between genders, about $51,000 annually pre-tax salary that a woman would earn on average in Canada versus about $67,700 for a male. And it is kind of disconcerting because there's also from RBC, they're finding that the pandemic also just wiped out years and years of gains that women have made in employment across Canada. Is the pandemic kind of a precarious time to be doing this? Is it the right time because people are willing to rethink the way that business has always been done?
Yes, so I agree with you absolutely. The pay gap is there, and you mentioned the ADP research. There's tons of research to suggest that it absolutely exists, and it is wide, and we need to be able to close it. So doing this work is really important. Right now, it's a tough time. It's a tough time to take on new priorities as a business. Many businesses are struggling to find their feet, find some sort of stability during the pandemic. And I agree with you. There is a regressive effect that's happening on women's work in the workplace, and the advancements we've been able to make with representation and the participation rate of women in the workplace is drastically decreasing very quickly due to the pandemic. So yes, well, those are two very real factors. In addition, I would add that the teams that normally take on this work, HR professionals, the leadership team that champion it, it's a completely new category of work that we've all been thrust into this year. The role of HR has now been pandemic steward, immediate remote work expert, and those sorts of things. So adding something else seems insurmountable. However, we actually believe that now is the critical time based on all of the stats that we're seeing around and the articles we're seeing around the pandemic having a poor impact on the participation rate of women in the workplace. And if we're not careful, based on my readings and many articles that are coming out recently, I believe that we're going to see a lot of that progress that we made actually roll back in the matter of a year or two if we aren't intentional about taking a focus on this work and prioritizing this work now. So yes, companies are looking to find their feet. Yes, companies are looking to stabilize, and saying yes to something new is tough. However, we believe it's absolutely critical to create a equitable level playing field once we get through and to that level of stability. It's no longer a nice to have, it's absolutely required these days.
Well, of course, you guys said that at Unbounce, you were able to close that gap immediately. But what if you're a business? It might seem like a daunting task. You don't know where revenue streams are coming in the midst of the pandemic. What is the pledge asking? And maybe what are you guys offering to do to help people out with this?
Yeah, so we are one of the ways in which we want to make this easier for companies to say yes to is provide a step-by-step guide. That might seem a toolkit. That might seem very obvious, but when it comes to these sorts of very long-term nebulous type of issues, oftentimes it's difficult to get to the what's step one, what's step two, what's step three. And we want to take all that work off of everyone's plate and say, here's a guide, just start. So we're offering that level of support to anyone who takes the pledge and is interested in starting this work. So the toolkit is number one, and then we are also we're creating a community of fellow pledgees to discuss, what are the options for closing the gap if you find it? What about a concern or a question around a certain step of the toolkit that you're struggling with? Creating a community and bringing some openness to these conversations. Generally, individuals try to shy away and companies try to shy away talking about compensation. And in these instances, that's not necessarily the most positive. I think the more information, open communication we can have around that, and we're trying to create that community, will only help to further the work and create more importance around the work. As far as companies looking to close the gap and maybe not being in the position to do so now if they do find one, it's really important to note that we're suggesting that companies look at the adjusted pay gap first and look at that. So that's comparing apples to apples. You compare a intermediate level employee in one department who identifies as a woman to an intermediate employee in a certain department who identifies as a man. It's apples to apples comparison. So yes, if you do find a gap, which often will be the case, our first and foremost recommendation is, can you close it now and do it? That's not obviously a reality for many people, especially right now during this pandemic. So our suggestion is to take steps to, over a few years, look to see how you can start to close that and take those steps that we talked about earlier around process and procedure to ensure that they're not continuing to happen. So create that structure, that procedure, that process, take actionable steps today to close any areas that you're able to, and then make a plan. And we're very much focusing on progress over perfection. Like any business initiative, we are never going to be able to snap our fingers around issues relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and have a solution tomorrow. That wouldn't be true of any other project we undertake from an organizational perspective. So it's not true either with pay parity. It's not true either with diversity, equity, inclusion. So we are encouraging progress over perfection and highlighting where the gaps and where the progress needs to be made.
What's your sense about the appetite right now? Is there kind of, it's going to be obvious, there's much more widespread recognition now than there would be, say, 30 years ago about this issue. But you guys do have some early partners on board since launching this on Monday. How is reaction to it, and how is kind of the overall recognition amongst business community at large that we do need to address this?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So we actually looked to launch this initially back at the end of March, which is symbolic Equal Pay Day in Canada. And obviously, like every other business, we were thrown for a loop with the pandemic and immediately working from home, and it just couldn't be a top priority for us at the time. So with that, we, as you mentioned, we have some really great partners on board. We have some really fantastic pledgees that were able to commit to pledging with us as well. And we found that now, even more so than pre that March date, we've had significant interest, significantly more interest. It seems like it's an easier yes for individuals to get to a yes and to really want to prioritize that pay. So absolutely, the interest is high, and the sharing and conversations around this topic as a way of progress and moving forward through this pandemic and being able to actually tackle a recovery that will include women at the same level as pre-pandemic has been really inspiring for us.
Well, I feel like I should name drop the name of the pledge once more before we wrap up, but it's a Pay Up for Progress pledge. If somebody wants to find out more information, what is maybe the best route for them to follow?
Absolutely. I think the best route for them to follow is to visit the Unbounce blog or follow us on social. We are talking about it all the time right now, as well as, we are just Googling for Pay Up for Progress. That's the best way to go forward and find us. And there's tons of information and the toolkit available on the landing page as well.
Well, excellent. Leslie, I really appreciate you making time to talk about this issue. It's one that I think we can all agree is very important here. But thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
That's Leslie Collin of Unbounce, and that is it for the show today. But we will be back on Wednesday with more from our Women in Business series. For now, I'm Tyler Orton, and you can go to biv.com for more stories and more interviews there.